Everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on what to expect at COP28. My name is Rena Ninen, the founder of Good Trouble Productions, and I am excited to help join this conversation and see what we can expect in the weeks to come. I'm joined today by Landon Darrence, Senior Director for Global Energy Center, and Richard Morningstar Chair for Global Energy Security at the Atlantic Council, Jorge Gastelumunde, Interim Director for the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, also at the Atlantic Council. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Rama Yad, Senior Director for the Africa Center. Thank you all very much for finding the time to join us today. It is a fascinating period, as COP is expected to take place in the Middle East, where we're dealing with issues such as extreme heat, food insecurity, and also water scarcity, all important issues. And it's all coming at a point where this conference is being held in an oil and gas producing nation. So without further ado, I'd love to kick it off. And I'd love to sort of ask you guys, maybe starting with you, Ambassador, why do you think it is that past climate conferences have really failed to deliver tangible results?
Thank you very much, Rena, and thank you all for joining this important conversation. Thank you, Global Energy Center, for organizing it. Yeah, it's a pleasure to answer this important question as the COP28 is approaching in a few days in Dubai. And for Africans, this COP28 is maybe a turning point because not only because the Emirates pledged $4.5 billion to finance climate projects on the African continent, but also more broadly because it has been precedented by a Nairobi Climate Week for the first time, and it was pretty successful because Africans came with solutions, alternatives for themselves and for the rest of the world, because as you know, an important part of the future of the climate, global climate, will go through the African continent. And this agenda was important for Africans because, like you said, there is a lot of things that needs to be covered, and it's the case. It has been the case for decades. So many COPs during these past decades, and so much disappointment for Africans. Africans are not responsible for the climate change. They are responsible for less than 3% of gas emissions in the world. Among the countries who pollute the most, the 7 first countries, there is no African country. The best student of the climate class is Gambia, an African country, when it comes to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So that said, all these promises made by the international community to help to support the financing of climate change, global warming, these promises have not been met, and that's really a problem, and that's why these recent meetings, international gatherings around climate, have been so important for Africans, because Africans could come with alternatives, like on the climate finance space. So that's why it's so important, and that's the main challenge Africans face right now. There's many others, but we'll have the opportunity in this conversation to come back to them. Thank you. Rena, you are muted. Still.
Oh, thank you. My apologies. My dog was barking, so I hit the mute button. My apologies to you. I want to ask you, Ambassador, thank you so much. I want to let everyone know in about 45 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions, and you can go ahead and submit your questions to askac.org. We'll be taking a look at that and answering some of them. Jorge, I want to turn to you and ask you a little bit about what you think could make this COP successful when past others have failed.
First of all, I wanted to thank the Global Energy Center for organizing this. Thank you so much, Landon, and others in the team. This is a great opportunity to have a conversation. I think it's this COP, and it has becoming more increasingly the case, and hopefully this will be one in which it will be even more apparent, is the need for action, and the extremely important role that the private sector could play on that. I've been taking a rather, I used to be a climate negotiator. I've been taking a rather radical position on that over time, in terms of how much importance is given to the efforts inside the negotiations per se, and the formal negotiations, and how much the focus needs to be put on what is happening outside of the negotiations. For this COP to be successful, and I think it might be the case to a certain degree, we need to see a strong leadership from private sector actors, both in the on the mitigation side of things, from energy and transportation, aviation, to the adaptation front as well. There is so much action that needs to be happening on adaptation, and so much financial innovation that could happen there to address the needs of people around the world to adapt to climate change. So if anything, we could highlight from the potential that this COP brings to the table, and the pragmatic view that the COP presidency and other non-negotiated aspects of the conference bring, is the role and investment of private sector across the board, for both reducing emissions and also to adapting to climate change, and why not also to loss and damage. I think there is a huge potential to bring the private sector more in the forefront on how to address loss and damage moving forward. And I'll be happy to discuss more on that. But my sense is that over time, over the past 5 years, the evolution of the Conference of the Parties have moved away from only focusing on negotiations to indicating a signaling, or allowing a space for the private sector and other actors, including the philanthropic sector, to signal what's a role that they have to play to take on action, real action on the ground, as of yesterday.
All right, Jorge, thank you. Landon, I want to turn to you. Jorge talks about the importance of the private sector being engaged and involved, that could be transformative for this COP. But when you talk about financing and the needs of financing to be made available, particularly to developing countries, how confident are you that this COP might be different?
Great to be here, Rena, and thank you for hosting us. I think we started this conversation talking about tangible results, and a distinction needs to be made. There have been tangible results in the UNFCCC process, and I think that culminates diplomatically with the Paris Agreement. What you're seeing now, and what you're seeing a feature and focus of the Emirati COP of COP28, is perhaps a more inclusive approach as we look to embolden the calls and the consistent calls over the last decade for implementation and action. And so I think that's certainly a mandate that the Emiratis have taken on from an energy perspective. So when I'm, talking to them from our issue set, a country that has, you mentioned, is an oil-producing nation. It's also a nuclear power in terms of nuclear energy, and it is a country that has access and deploys a significant amount of clean energy resources as well. So I think we're looking to see that kind of deployment and that kind of action now implemented with a much broader slate of actors. Of course, COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh really saw a resurgence and growth in terms of the global South, and a coherent voice, looking for the exact aspects that Rama indicated in the beginning, which is a need for finance. That if we're going to look and seek for the scale of change that is necessary to meet a 1.5 future, a 2-degree future of limiting global warming, then we need to meet people where they're at and really engage them in terms of the economic opportunities and growth for those countries and for those individuals, that then enables the emissions reductions to follow. And so I think you're going to see an emphasis on this thematically. I'm sure that there'll be a revisitation of many of the pledges, and maybe some organic growth, the global methane pledge, et cetera, over time. Now we're looking not only to see pledges, but to see industry matching those pledges with the action that the Emiratis are trying to inspire.
Ambassador Yad, when you talked earlier about you think this could be a turning point, this particular conference, in the need for help and resources, but what do you think will define the COP28 agenda?
I mean, we have a few elements about the programming of the COP, but that will be confirmed during the events. But what strikes me the most right now is the context in which it takes place. Things are accelerating a lot. You know, we have a lot of these crises from Kiev to Tel Aviv, and you know how the market, the energy market, is disrupted by all these crises. The food insecurity is also very important. We have some critically important situations in a few countries, important countries in Africa, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, not to mention the DRC. And in this context, I mean, it's really key for the Emirates to roll up the sleeves and to be able to reflect the importance of what we are experiencing right now. There's a huge difference between what we experienced like even 2 years ago and what's going on right now in terms of needs, of emergency, of scale too. And the level of expectations has never been so high. And I think that when it comes to Africa, beyond the climate finance or the funding needs, Africa faces a lot of challenges: droughts, floods, declining agricultural productivity, deforestation. A few weeks ago, the Republic of Congo hosted the Three Basin Summit, and this is beyond Africa. The difficult access to water, the rising seas, the advancing desert, and of course the impact on the populations in terms of exodus and climate refugees. So as you can see, Africa is 55 countries, and most of them have to face one of these, or several of these, or many of these challenges. So it's about mitigation, but it's beyond that. It's about a lifestyle. It's about agricultural production. It's about food. It's about health. It's about education and urbanization, because the continent will be will experience this growing urbanization, and that's really key to work on green cities, for example, on water, on waste, and all these challenges requires multilateral, but also support for internal national policies. So that's what strikes me the most. And the question is, the key question, the next COP will be this: are the Emirates able to tackle, in terms of debates and conversation and discussions, to tackle all these issues, because they are all they are linked. My last point here is to say that the Emirates, they have a huge ambition when it comes to Africa. I reminded you the numbers in terms of investing in climate projects in Africa, but beyond that, the Emirates, and it's not very well known by the people, are the fourth most important trading partner of African countries. You know, after China, of course, European Union, India, and Emirates is the fourth. So beyond, in terms of trade. So what I mean here is, for them, it will be a very important COP28.
Well, thank you very much for laying that out and making it very clear about why this region is so important, particularly for this conference. When you look, Jorge, at past successes, for instance, COP26, there was a launch of the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. COP27, they established a loss and damage fund. And then, there were previous COPs that looked to, meet emissions targets, for instance. What do you believe, Jorge, what do you believe will be the benchmarks for success of COP28?
Thanks for that question. I think I would go back to 1992 when the convention was adopted. The mission, the main objective of the convention at that point for all countries was to avoid dangerous concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to a point in which it will damage the economy and the ecosystem. Unfortunately, we lost that battle. We have gotten to a point in which, as we can see from multiple reports from the Adaptation Gap report that was recently published by UNEP, by the fifth climate assessment report that has been launched actually today by the US government, we see that concentration has created a set of disruptions in the economy, a set of disruptions, as Ambassador Yad was mentioning, in terms of migration, a set of disruptions in terms of natural ecosystems and climate disasters, with a large impact on the economy in terms of losses. So we are faced with now a challenge, that is, we need to deal with two objectives. We need to keep fighting for innovation, political will to address the increased emission of greenhouse gases, which is not going down. And we also need to address adaptation to climate change. So what is going to set up success for this COP is the realization of parties and all our kind of actors, including private sector and philanthropy and cities and civil society, that we have two objectives as a humankind. We have the objective of reducing emissions, and we have the objective of adapting to climate change. And for adapting to climate change, what we've been doing at Arsht is trying to raise awareness of both the effects of climate change, in particularly focus on extreme heat and the effects that has on women, the effects that it has on health, an early indication of a positive signal for the presidency in this COP is that for the very first time we're going to have a health day. So there's a strong focus on how the climate impacts health of people around the world. I think we have a strong case to be made for women in particular, and other vulnerable groups and communities and marginalized groups in society that are getting the brunt of the impacts on health, both in terms of the lack of protection and capacity to protect from climate change, but also the lack of access to services, particularly health services. And so I think a lot of the focus needs to be put on that effort, on how adaptation is addressed and how health is considered part of that. The other piece is how we can further channel financial resources towards adaptation. The gap is huge. The gap is, between 16 and 18 times the need. And that's, the recent report from the Adaptation Gap report from UNEP. And so there needs to be a serious conversation in terms of how that's going to be done. And part of the conversation is going to be driven by the Loss and Damage Fund. And I think a lot of the attention is going to go towards that. A big question I put on the table, and I will stop until the next round of questions, if that allows me, is that we're going to have to think way beyond the usual idea of having a centralized fund with some donor money coming in, and then having that money being distributed out for developing countries to receive that money. I think we need to think seriously on how other actors and how other financial innovations could be done, how the financial system as a whole could actually be reformed to allow for adaptation to be completely mainstream into the actions of the day-to-day investments of both multilateral banks and also private sector private financial actors across the board, on how they mainstream adaptation into their usual operations. And just wanted to leave you with one citation, from the Paris Agreement. As Landon said before, the Paris Agreement set out the rules of engagement for all countries and all actors around the world to actually do action. So keep negotiating on this. Might just sometimes be counterintuitive to what the Paris Agreement was putting on the table. Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement established that as a goal, is a third goal. So there's a first goal in the Paris Agreement on mitigation, the second on adaptation, and a third on finance. And the one on finance says finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse emissions and climate resilient development. It's not saying climate finance, it's saying all finance flows. You know, the point in which we buy an apple or we buy a chocolate, like how can we mainstream the climate considerations in every single action, economic action and financial action that we take as a society? And that's, I think, that the signal of success that we could hopefully, expect from COP this year.
Jorge, thank you for that perspective. I just want to remind everyone we are accepting questions right now at askac.org. Feel free to submit them and we'll have our terrific panel answer some of those in just a bit. And also, if you're following us on social media, be sure to use the handles at AC Global Energy and at Arsht and also at AC Africa Center. Landon, you obviously focus greatly on the energy sector, and we know this year's conference will place a large amount of attention on the energy sector. What specific features of the energy transition do you anticipate really getting the most amount of focus?
Yeah, Rena, the energy space, you can't be a country like the Emirates and be 3% of global conventional energy trade and not have a focus on energy in your COP. And so I think there's the Emiratis are cognizant of that need and set up early a mitigation track for all intents and purposes, right? You have the finance element, you have an adaptation element, you have a mitigation element. Within that mitigation track, you really can think about that as energy transition. And they would articulate that they break this up into 4 components. So component 1 is clean energy deployment in the developing world. There's a perception there that we need to continue and have a thriving renewable energy market, and that those energies and those technologies, which are increasingly and broadly financially viable on their own, the developed world doesn't need the help and support for that, but we do need to continue to emphasize and focus dollars into the developing world to have those technologies deployed at a similar scale, and that's where you're seeing benchmarks like triple renewable energy deployment, and those kind of benchmarks are emanating from that vein. But the other component, the other 3 components really fit into one vertical, in my opinion. So it's about decarbonization, both from an industrial-based side and from an oil and gas side. And it's about kind of the energy technology of the future. So where are we and how are we supporting the hydrogen economy? How are we supporting advanced reactors and nuclear, zero emission technology deployment? And I think that body of work is where most eyes are on this COP. So in my opinion, historically, when we look at changing the disposition of the emissions profile in these industries, a lot of attention's on traditional international oil companies. What's unique about the Emirati COP2 is they're now going to embrace and take the position of saying, we do have a national oil company. These are organizations that are not culpable, not responsible to shareholders, that don't have the same external pressures, but we're going to bring them in and include them in this COP. Now that's controversial, of course, because this is a process, and the oil and gas industry is a scalable factor in terms of where we are with emissions today. But bringing them in is actually an effort to engage people and change the disposition of how they do business. And I think that's going to be a benchmark of success from our perspective, is can you find that level of inclusivity? Can you see about changing the trajectory of the decarbonization agenda? And I would expect a lot of emphasis on that as we move forward in Dubai.
And Landon, when you look at this, what do you feel like the most areas for progress or transformative deliverables might be?
The number one place where we see a ton of convergence is in the space of methane. If we're going to meet our 2030 or mid-century benchmarks, we have to address one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and that's methane. And I think the reason why you're seeing this convergence, and you're seeing industry, you're seeing civil society, you're seeing the climate community and governments all get behind action, is because they're within the investment cycle. We know these technologies are viable. We know they, in many cases, are financially viable to deploy. So yes, you still have some of the same features that you would in the context of clean energy deployment in the developing world. There are countries that are going to need support to make this happen. But ultimately, I think that the global methane pledge is going to turn into a feature and facet of momentum now, where we're actually seeing a near zero methane 2030 as a universal benchmark. And you know, you will be able to tell the success of that pledge, not today, not tomorrow, not next year, but I think we're going to have a very consistent rhythm of addressing and approaching this community in a way that is achieving this across the globe in very difficult countries to operate in at times. You know, you think about Turkmenistan, Algeria, these are countries that don't have the same standards and positions that the United States, Europe, the Middle East, frankly, ADNOC and Aramco in the Middle East. So we're going to try to see if there's some incremental progress that can be made here, but with a very ambitious timeline of net zero 2030.
Mm-hmm. Jorge, when you sort of look at what COP28 needs to deliver when it talks about really protecting the people, their livelihoods, the ecosystems from the effects of climate change, and especially in the Middle East, they're really feeling. What makes you optimistic about what could come of this, and where do you see the potential pitfalls?
I think what makes me most optimistic is building on the work that we've been doing as a center over the past years. Just wanted to share that this year, early in the year, we partnered with the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, which has a membership of 2.6 million women in the informal sector, and with Blue Marble, you know, a company, an NGO, non-for-profit actor funded by self-insurance companies, to design a product that would provide supplementary income to informal working women, members of SEIVA. And it was a success in terms of us being able to design a technical product that will work as an insurance product whenever there was a heat wave during the heat season, which lasts for about 3 months in Ahmedabad in India. That if the temperature exceeded you know, a level, then the insurance will be triggered, similar to when you're driving your car and you crash. So that event will be the trigger for that insurance to be activated. That will activate a payout in advance of a heat wave to the women that were insured by this product. And that will allow them to have resources to decide whether they want to risk their health and go out for work because of a need to do that and have an income, or to stay at home, or even to buy protective gear with that funding. So that will allow them to keep, you know, protect their health while they were out. We were able to put this in the market with a local insurer in India that was willing to put to sell that product for us. And we were able to also bring the private sector, an insurance company, Howden, to pay a portion of the premium subsidies towards that insurance, plus the philanthropic money that we're putting on from our side. All the pieces of an insurance worked for a sector that usually is not addressed. All the pieces of that insurance work for women that usually do not receive those kind of services. And all of those pieces work by bringing private sector, philanthropic side, and even, you know, community organizations to the table. So these are the kind of things that I think we can portray at COP. We are working currently with a major donor, and hopefully we'll be able to indicate that at COP that we will be expanding this exercise across the Southeast Asia region. These are the kind of things that show action on the ground. And I expect for multiple other actors to bring to the table their actions. We've been working also with the UN climate change high-level champions and Mars McLennan, which is a major private finance sector entity that, you know, hosts a set of services, including insurance services, on developing a framework that could be used by all the 6,000 insurance companies around the world to both develop projects from the insurance sector that invest on adaptation and reduction of risk from climate change, and then portray how their investments are actually allowing communities to be better prepared for the impacts of climate change. So insurance companies not only waiting for the event to happen and then for them to do a payout, but how insurance companies could actually invest their resources, both analytical resources, philanthropic resources, towards reducing risk and showcasing that in a common framework that could be used by all 6,000 companies around the world. We've been working with that insurance sector to actually deploy that, and we'll be presenting a report with 50 projects that are ready to run from insurance companies, showing how that could be done. So I think there is a lot to expect in terms of how we can show action in this COP, and how different actors, including philanthropic side, community organizations, cities, and the private sector, could actually play a role in hand with the public sector. There is much to say about those collaborations and the potential partnerships in different sectors to showcase how action on the ground for climate change could be taking place.
Ambassador Young, picking up where Jorge left off about the importance of action on the ground, you spoke a little bit about the climate situation in Africa, not of the own doing of the countries necessarily. What do you think the African nations need COP to deliver for them? And when you look at past COPs, why do you believe that there's been a failure to deliver for this continent?
Yeah, great question. And I totally approve what Jorge just said. This is very important to take the ground into consideration. And I think that's one of the the biggest challenges that we have to face now. Because the vital industrial transformation of the continent today, of course, cannot be at the expense of the nature's protection. But from an African point of view, this environmental policy should be more inclusive for the local communities. For example, it's very difficult for Africans to hear that gas energy will be defunded. No investment anymore because it pollutes too much, or for any reason. At the very moment when many African countries discover gas opportunities, and 600 million Africans suffer from a lack of electricity. So, and as you know, like I told you, this request comes at the very moment when they have so many developmental needs to feed the populations, to provide housing opportunities, to where they need to build hospitals, schools, and they have to stop everything because of the global warming. And so they want, for example, gas that the international community considers gas as a transition energy. So that is something that needs to be heard, because when you don't have any electricity to feed yourself, or to have light or anything, warmth, so it's very complicated. First, two, I think also it's important to better reconcile development and natural protection. Sometimes there may be a misunderstanding when we don't take the time to understand the African needs. Just an example about this very trendy wildlife conservation, natural conservation, parks, very appreciated by tourists, for example. This is a case of what we should not do, because to preserve wildlife in Africa, we have ousted the populations from the forest, for example. And the problem is the African ecosystems cannot be considered without the populations who live there, and Africa has never been an empty space, and the Lion King is a myth in Africa. It does not exist anywhere. And the problem is these reservations that have been settled, it came with a blame of African population for the degradation of the space. So it's very important for international organizations to understand that it's important to keep the people there because they have a role. They take care of the biodiversity of the forest, and when we expel them from that space and deprive them from their right to occupy their own land, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. The forests are in danger, and that has been the case for the last 3 decades. So to avoid this kind of misunderstanding, the expropriation, or it's very important to listen the farmers who have been living in the African parks in the last 30 years. So this is very important to give more consideration to African solutions, because even there you will find also that they have a traditional know-how of the best way to tackle these questions. Because in these countries, and it is a case in Asia and in Latin America, the fight for environment is first and foremost a social and cultural struggle to defend the land inherited from ancestors, you see, rather than simply an effort to preserve a stock of resources. It is a struggle that is really rooted in the working classes too. So it's a social and cultural fight. It's not a trendy thing, and that's why it's so important to include them and to better reconcile development and natural protection.
Great points just about how that is important, and they have their own approach to it as well. When you talk about, Ambassador Yad, the African negotiating bloc, how do you think it differs from other regional blocs and groupings?
I think it's maybe on the African side, it is the main challenge. I am not sure that Africans can be considered as a group, as a bloc, as a team, even a team, because like I said, it's 55 countries, 54 or 55. It depends if we recognize all of them or not, but 55 countries. And these countries are very diverse, various problematics, and challenges and opportunities. They are not the same cultures, the same communities. They don't speak the same languages. The landscapes are different. The level of development are different. And you have so many organizations, regional organizations that are in charge of all these topics, and even the development, the MDBs are very, very various. So it's very important to tailor the policies to Africa and to size these differences. But at the same time, there is also a lack of representation at the highest level. The African Union is, of course, the Pan-African organization, political organization. You have also these Pan-African development banks or organizations that work on the climate space, of course. But I think that Africans could do better in terms of speaking with one voice on the global stage. Now they have a permanent seat at the G20, a decision that have been announced at the last G20 in India, and that's really an important decision that has been made there. And now, will it be possible for the president of the African Union Commission to speak at the same level as the president of the European Commission, Moussa Faki and Ursula von der Leyen? That is the question here. Will he be able to talk on behalf of 1 billion people, and in what terms? That is something the Africans will have to deal with, and very quickly.
For those of you joining us, I want to remind you can submit questions to our esteemed panel here at askac.org, and we'll attempt to take them. We're going to go to questions in just a moment, but Landon, I want to turn to you. A lot of people consider this a do or die moment for the conventional energy sector. What steps do you think that the sector needs to take to demonstrate that it can be a constructive actor on climate change?
It is a certainly an elevated pressure on industry to act, and one of the facets that the Emiratis have put forward is this concept of a global decarbonization accelerator with a pillar that focuses specifically on oil and gas, decarbonization accelerator, which is seeking that kind of momentum that you've seen from some companies. So I don't want to trivialize, for example, the commitments that have been made through the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, through tracking OGMP, the Methane Partnership 2.0, and efforts to actually show climate progress. There are companies that have done that, but those companies are the minority in terms of the scale of impact. And there's a lot of emphasis in the industry about being the cleanest molecule. This idea that you are the future and the best aspect of investment in a corporation that deals with conventional energy is that you provide the cleanest molecule. I'd contest that after this year. We spend a lot of time with industry. I do think on an individual level, maybe that's a good business model to pursue. I wouldn't encourage anybody to deviate from that. But ultimately, if the industry is going to have a viable path forward, if you are 10% of global supply, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, you're not being measured by 10% of oil, 10 million barrels a day. You're being measured by 102 million barrels of oil a day, and the aggregate industry pathway to show that you're not further contributing to it and further exacerbating the climate crisis. And I think that what we're hoping to see this year is an appreciation, an acknowledgement. I don't think anybody is looking for the climate community to necessarily welcome oil and gas or to appraise commitments made. But I think that if we're doing this successfully, what we're going to see is that industry saying, I'm ready to make scope 1, 2 benchmarks. I'm ready to do near zero methane 2030. I'm going to collaborate on how to do an aggregate avenue for measurement and verification of the emissions that are coming out of our sector so that we have an even playing field and we can articulate credibly to the global community that emissions are going on a downward slope and we're a part of the solution. And I think that that's, if I was to go to the other side and not just focus on industry, but tell civil society and the climate community, ultimately, if you want to abate methane emissions, you have to engage this community. Because addressing the challenges we have, and I'm just focusing on methane, this goes for the aggregate emissions profile of the industry, but the addressing methane emissions requires us building gas infrastructure. And so we have to be comfortable with this acknowledgement that the world's not just fractured in terms of brown and green field, right? That we don't just have clean and we don't just have dirty. But in many ways, part of the energy transition and part of meeting our climate ambition is taking something incrementally and saying, okay, it might be brown right now, but how quickly and realistically can we make that green? And there's comments that Jorge and Ambassador Yade have made today in the context of the importance of approaching people, recognizing that lives and livelihoods matter, that people are going to embrace this transition in a different way, not just on the emissions profile of how production is made, or what the climate impact is of these decisions, which I hope permeate decisions made by industry. But ultimately, we need to be affording people economic opportunity in concert with this emissions profile. And this convergence and bringing people together from the conventional energy space and from civil society and the climate community, I really don't see this manifesting at the same scale again post UAE, and having Dr. Sultan, who ultimately wears many hats, but one of them is the CEO of ADNOC, with him representing and giving this community the most viable pathway to engage constructively in the UNFCCC process, but more importantly on the action agenda, the framework around the UNFCCC process to demonstrate action and credibility.
Thank you very much, Landon. Jorge, I want to toss a question from the audience to you and just remind everyone you could submit your questions at askac.org. Jorge, this question, I think it's a great question for you. It asks, do you think that a block in the negotiations about loss and damage could affect the whole outcomes of COP28?
Yes, it will. I think that because loss and damage conversation is a representation of a tension that has been going on since the convention, which is a differentiation between developed and developing countries, and how at that point in time, and for very long period of time, 150 years before that, countries that have been able to graduate to a level of being developed countries were, using an economic model that was based on fossil fuels, and that, pushed them to a point in which they could, claim that position and then have the economic development that they had, vis-a-vis other countries that didn't do that, didn't have the chance to do that. So there's a whole ethical conversation around that has been permeating all the discussions for the past 28 COPs or 27 COPs. And that's going to be much the case this time around, now represented by the Loss and Damage Fund discussion. As you can see from the previous discussions of the Transitional Committee over the year, with one coming a week ago, it's clear that there is still that distinction and that tension between who is responsible for what. The matter of fact is that the world has changed dramatically from 1992 to today. There are a set of countries around the world that have the economic power to address some of the issues that other countries around the world haven't been able to address in terms of adapting to climate change, modernizing their urban energy, transportation sectors that haven't been able to do. And so that tension is that evolution, over the past years, show that we have to reframe the conversation around responsibility and contribution, and for where we are at right now. After the loss and damage, the agreement around the loss and damage discussion of a loss and damage fund in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, I remember writing a piece along with Landon and others for AC, saying, the fact that we are not allowing for an opening of China, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, other countries around the world to be also looking into addressing loss and damage, and the fact that we are not capping the emissions to a certain degree, is just creating more losses and damages down the road that will be in responsibility of the current major emitters. So we're just prolonging and kicking the can down the road in terms of who is being responsible for that. And if the conversation is going to be about responsibility, then this is a never-ending conversation. So I think the failure of an agreement around loss and damage is going to signal a failure of how the multilateral system is operating in terms of how we understand and address climate change. There's, of course, historical responsibility. There is, of course, a huge opportunity for actors, not only the historical ones, but also the ones that are major emitters at this point in time, to take action to support developing countries around the world, LDCs, SIDS, you name it. And so that's a portion of it. Now, the other portion of the answer to that question is, so what do we do about it? Is it, if the process in itself and the loss and damage fund is not approved, and it's seen as a failure of the process, are we just, go back to our houses feeling depressed and saying, well, nothing happened? That's a portion of the discussion around climate change. As I was saying before, I think for me, the signal of success in a COP, and this COP could be the one because of the pragmatic approach that the COP presidency is taking and other actors are taking, is what do we see from other actors that are not governments? What do we see from other actors that are not the negotiators that are sitting in those tables trying to negotiate an agreement around the loss and damage fund? If we see enough action, if we see enough ambition from energy actors to reduce emissions, to find solutions, technical solutions and political solutions at their level, if they identify opportunities in the space of adaptation to create new taxonomies, new incentives, new ways in which actors such as the insurance sector could be playing a role in loss and damage. Imagine, for example, that an insurance sector deploys all their analytical capacity to project what's going to be the losses and damages over the next 100 years by the LDCs, SIDS, and B20 countries, the vulnerable 20 countries, which adds up to around 100 countries around the world. What if you can have that capability to understand what is the amount of money that's going to be lost from climate-related events? What if then you calculate the level of risk appetite that the market could actually buy in, just private companies out of that because they better understand what is the risk of insuring those losses down the road. What if after doing all of that, you get to a point in which you can realize that you could cap the losses, the financial losses of countries at a certain degree of amount, and the rest being insured by the private sector? What if you use all the capability that is in the world from the private sector to understand better that situation? And then you create a conversation around loss and damage that is a real one, not anymore a theoretical one in which you have some countries that should be contributed to a fund and some other countries that should be benefiting from that fund, which at the end of the day, that money is going to represent probably, $1 billion, $5 billion, $10 billion, when the reality is that you need trillions of dollars to actually go into those countries to address losses and damages down the road. So I think for me, just focusing on the negotiations per se, it's an important element, but it's not the only element. And a COP should be, the success of a COP should be defined by these two elements, a pragmatic approach and the negotiations per se. But on the negotiations, just take it with a grain of salt.
All right. Jorge, thank you. Ambassador Yad, I've got a question for you here. How can we avoid a negotiations dispute between global North and South at COP28?
Yeah, that's the key dispute. We attend every COP. It's always the same. North, South. Disagree with the right way to do things. Who should fund the projects, the policies, the level of financial commitment. I think the time of this kind of talks is behind us now. Most African states, they have ratified all the environmental treaties that were requested from them. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the Paris Agreement in 2016, but also their own treaties internally, the African Union Agenda for 2063, and they have their own regional projects, the Blue Fund, the Desert to Power project, the Green Wall in the Sahel. Even at the level of countries, you have the Green Emerging Senegal plan, for example, for Senegal. Ethiopia is the same, Nigeria is the same. So the talks have been very productive in terms of producing treaties and launch of new projects related to climate and energy. But at this point, I really think that the level of emergency is so high that more than that is now required. If the next COP focuses on signing a new treaty, and all the talks and discussions are focused on that, I think it won't be so successful as we wish. At this time, the needs are too pressing. $50 billion per year by 2050, according to the UN, to the United Nations. That's the need in terms of funding, primary need in terms of funding. Two, you have the growing population in Africa, and this growing population raises the level of urgent needs, and this is something we have to tackle now, knowing that in a few years, 25% of the world population will be African, and 1.5 billion urban people among them. So really, if we want to make this COP28 more successful than the others, the main topic of discussion should not be focused on adopting a new text or a new treaty. And also, I think it's very important, beyond the general conversations or projects, to better focus on regional projects. In Africa, you have a lot of hotspots. One of them is, for example, the Lake Chad. The Lake Chad has lost 90% of its surface area in the 60s and in the 80s. So, and you have so many, like 4 or 5 million of climate refugees in the area, where there's a lot of countries, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, you know, and now they are under pressure of another threat, Boko Haram. So impossible to wait for these populations.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Yad. You know, as we wrap up, we've got several more questions, but I think we're going to end with this one. I'm going to do sort of a lightning round with all of you. Landon, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind, and end with Ambassador Yad. A question here: what do you think are the worst possible outcomes for COP28, and what are the best possible outcomes? Landon, I'll let you take this.
You know, I hopefully this has come across in my comments throughout this hour. You know, ultimately, I think we need to avoid further fracturing the system. This is an all hands on deck moment. The climate crisis does not require people lowering the ambition, but I do think it requires embracing action from communities that maybe there's been some reticence to engage previously. Certainly, you know, Dr. Sultan and the Emiratis are not the first oil and gas producing country to have the COP. And in fact, the Qataris have had it. You just look at the last 3 COPs, Egypt, UK, and Poland as well, all had components of hydrocarbons in their systems, in their energy systems. They are producers. And I think that shouldn't marginalize the opportunity to really galvanize support. So for me, the worst possible outcome is that we see further division and we don't see this inclusive approach take place. The most positive and the best possible outcome is that inclusivity is then matched by progress and ambition and commitments to actually show and demonstrate that achieving the emissions reductions from the energy sector is possible when you engage these communities.
Right, Jorge?
Worst possible outcome for me is that I think there are 2 major outcomes that are expected for this COP. One is a strong signal to what the outcomes of the global stocktake are going to look like, and whether we are reaching that 1.5 degree. The second is the loss and damage fund. So if I think that if the global stocktake indicates that there is no much advance on that, which might be the case, and it's taken as a signal of of being defeated, and the loss and damage fund, it's agreed but with no major indication of how it's going to be funded, I think those are going to be worse outcome for COP. There are multiple other agreements that could be achieved, but these are the 2 that are going to be the main focus of the negotiations. The best possible outcome is not that the global stocktake, I think, is kind of set, so it's not going to be super pretty in terms of the outcomes of it. So the spin of how that's going to look like in the community, I think it's going to make it better. And the same with the loss and damage fund. Even if it's not agreed, then what comes next? So for me, the best possible outcome is that whatever is agreed on global stocktake and the loss and damage fund are going to have a strong and positive signal from other actors around the world for taking action, and that it's going to come together. Like, the signal of the COP is going to be a composition of both the public sector possibilities and all the other actors' possibilities to make this happen on the ground, and action that could deploy the capacity of making a global stocktake, the next one, more ambitious, and making a loss and damage fund and the losses and damages attention even further decentralized and more supported by several actors and only by this fund itself.
All right, Ambassador Yad, we've got about 60 seconds left. I want to let you have the final word.
Yeah, the worst outcome for me, to answer your question, Rina, would be for Africans to arrive there divided without no united message. Africans need to help the international community to help them. And at the Nairobi Climate Week, in Kenya, President of Kenya, William Ruto, said that they need a firm and clear voice of United Africa. So I hope that they will arrive there with that united voice. Otherwise, it can work. And to finish and end on a positive note, the biggest success would be, I think, we mentioned the gap between the North and the South. I think the biggest success should be bridge the gap between the officials, wherever they come from, and the civil societies. I think it's very important to have not an official COP and an informal COP outside. It's important to have everybody agree with the importance of tackling these issues together and bridging this gap. That's very key for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yad. As you mentioned at the start of this, you're saying this is very much a turning point, that you believe it's critical of this conference. We heard also you guys discuss the importance for leadership from the private sector. And also this is all happening as the energy markets have been disrupted by crisis around the world. I want to thank all of you for your perspective, Landon, Jorge, and Ambassador Yad, for giving us a little preview as to what to expect for COP28. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rina.
Thank you.